Today, Perek Aleph Halacha Ches in Hilchos Megillah. Kvar she'einich lassen by Risheni v'Chamishi. Kvar that they don't gather together on the Mondays and Thursdays. What happens? We'll go down to the Peirush. In the Peirush it says, Ein koyon ois ela b'Yudalad. The only possibility you have is Yudalad, as we mentioned earlier. And Yudalad you can only do even if Yochid. Amagen Mishnah, Mitzayin Mishnah. Amagen Mishnah cites the Mishnah Megillah, hey. Amar Yehuda, 5a. Amar Yehuda, Amosai, when is Mogen Shenechus Misheni V'Chamishi? When do you say that you make it earlier on the day that that's only where they gather on Mondays and Thursdays. But a place that they don't gather, not on the second Mondays, not on Thursdays, you don't read it only on its time, which is on the 14th. And in Sanhedrin 24b, it says that when Rabbi Yehuda says Amosai, he comes to explain the words of the Chachamim, not to disagree. In other words, he's not disagreeing with them, even though he is a separate statement. And every city, any city doesn't have 10 people sitting and learning there, Knesses who are always found in the Beis HaKnesses, for the needs of the tzibur, it's considered like a kvar. And you make it, you read earlier on Yom HaKnisa. If there aren't 10 people, what make their takona would cause them to lose out, and they would therefore be like a city, people of a large city. They would not read the Megillah on any day except Yudalit. What's that going to also mean? That making it earlier defeats the purpose. I guess the Mishnah explains that you make it to the day earlier to the day of Knisa, right? This will upset things because then they have a rule like a kvar. And when you read on the 14th, this is the takono that is judged like an ear. And it's as if it said, as the fact that it doesn't have the 10 people is its rectification, even though it says takona kilkulosahi, that the rectification is what causes the predicament. The kavonim is the reverse. That the predicament is what causes here when you don't have 10 who live there, so that you rectify it by considering it a big city, and you can only read it on the 14th. What does it mean, takona? That it's called like a big city, because to read it before and to be considered like a kvar is called a failing. Therefore, if there's in the city 10 people or batlonim who sit there in the Beis HaKnesses, it's considered like a big city. And if there's no 10 people sitting there in Beis HaKnesses, it doesn't have a law of a city, and it is therefore not correct to make it earlier. And therefore, you consider like a kvar, that you read it on Yom HaKnisa. And he adds, that the Rambam adds, if there's no 10 people, then that causes a problem for them. They have to read only like a big city without a wall, which is on the 14th, and that rectifies the situation, because even if you're individuals, you can read on the 14th. But the Kesef Mishnah says you could explain that they can go earlier. That's the rectification. And when they have to read the Megillah in one day, on the 14th, that causes them a problem. According to that, the Lashon Rambam would be understood simply that when you have 10 batlonim, they have to go earlier to the day of gathering. And he adds further that we cannot assume that if there's not 10 people, you have to consider them to be a small crowd that goes earlier, but rather the reverse. If there's no 10 people, they have to read only on the 14th like a big city. We'll turn the page. In the second explanation of the Kesef Mishnah, which is the exact reverse, that the rectification means that they can read like the people in the Kforim, and they can go earlier to the day of Knesset. Kalkola, this problem that they don't have any special day of the 14th to read in it. And when there's no 10 people, they have the takana they can read on the 14th. When there's no 10 people, they have no takana to read earlier, like the Bnei Kforim on the day of gathering, but rather they have to read only on the 14th, and it's called Kilkolosum because they don't have 10 people sitting and learning the Beis Medrash. He includes that in Sanhedrin 22b and in Tainus 17b, it says Takanta Kilkoltohi. And there, the wording is used in the concept, like the first Peirush, that the rectification means that they read it like a city on the 14th. And to read it earlier and be considered like a kvar, that would mess things up. Only if you have 10 batlonim, it's considered like a big city. Lecha Mishnah explains that the kilkul problem is that when there's no 10 people there, you have a problem. And therefore, you rectify it like it's a big city, as like the first explanation of the Kesef Mishnah, and you read it on the 14th. The Magen Mishnah cites a Mishnah in Megillah 5a. What's a big city? If you have 10 batlonim. The Gemara says 10 batlonim in the Beis HaKnesses. Less than that, it's like a kfar. The Rambam would seem that only a city that has 10 batlonim and not a krach mugav choyma me'yeshua. It does not have a din like a krach that is surrounded by a wall from the times of Yeshua. Therefore, the Mishnah says what's called the ear. It doesn't mention krach. And as the Das Toisus, they explain in Megillah that the ear is smaller than the krach. It just has 10 batlonim. It's not really a big city. The krach that doesn't have 10 people is considered like a kvar. And the krach there is not talking about where you have a wall, but that it's a town, which are large places. Even the Rambam learns so, because he explains the need for 10 batlonim in the Beis Knesses by ear. He's of the opinion that the words of Yeshua and Levi, Krach, is talking about big places, big inhabited places. But if it doesn't have 10, if it doesn't have a wall, it doesn't have 10 batlonim, dinam kikvar shemagdam limaknisa. And the din is like a kvar that you have to go to the earlier date, which is Sunday or Thursday. Monday or Thursday. The Magen Mishnah cites a raya to the Rambam from what the Gemara says on Yeshua and Levi. What's he telling us? We learned what's a city. The Gemara answers Krach. He had to tell us about Krach. We know he needs to tell us, even though that they come there from all over. And Yeshua and Levi is talking about with a wall. What's the Gemara asking? What's the difference between a city and a krach? One has a wall that doesn't, one doesn't. It's talking about here, we're talking about a city, which reads on the 14th. Yeshua and Levi adds, a mugav chayma reads on the 15th. But if there's 10 batlonim k'vuyim Beis HaKnesses, it can't be that. Rather, Yeshua and Levi is talking in a big city, which is also called a krach. It's bigger than an ear, but it doesn't have 10 batlonim. So it's got a problem. It doesn't have a minyan. And even though it's a big city, and many live there, still, since there's no 10 people in Beis Medrash, therefore it has a rule like a small place. And they have to go back to the 11th, 12th, or 13th. But if it has a wall around it, they only read on the 15th, even if they don't have 10 batlonim. The Maggid Mishnah concludes that according to the Ramban and the Rashba, even when it's surrounded in Moshe Yeshua, you need 10 batlonim. If there's no 10 batlonim, then it goes back to being like a city. The disagreement here as to whether the rule of 11, 12, and 13 applies to the 15th. The Lechem Mishnah explains that the Rambam understood the statement of Yeshua ben Levi that a krach that was inhabited and then it was only surrounded with a wall, that it talks about the idea of, and that's only with regard to Kedusha of Boti or Yechoima. That doesn't apply to Megillah. Therefore, it wasn't mentioned at all. You learn from the Gemara, krach shechorav ulubsoiv yoshav, that it means it was destroyed from the 10 people that it had. And it's not talking where the walls were there from Moshe Yeshua. If it was Mukam Moshe Yeshua, then for sure, even if you don't have 10 batlonim, it would remain like a krach on the 15th. Prima Godim made an order that is 3 shitters. The Rambam, that a large city which has a wall from the time of Yeshua ben Nun always is on the 15th, and there's no change to that, whether or not they have 10 batlonim or not. The Ram, that if it doesn't have 10, then they can go back to the day of gathering, or they can read it on the 15th. And third, the Shittas Ramban or Rashba, which the Maggid Mishnah explains that if there's no 10 batlonim, then if they can read it, they can only read it on the 14th, and then they can go back to Yom HaKnisa, not on the 15th. Because once it doesn't have 10 batlonim, then it doesn't even have the din of, so let's say Prague, for example, if it wouldn't have 10 people just sitting besmedish, then you would have a problem of on the 15th. Interesting. Now, today, we never go earlier. But Kavos Chayma, we might be Yeshua ben Nun that it doesn't have 10 batlonim. The Mishnah Berurah writes, the Ramban, the Rashba, the Meiri, the Ritva, and the Yitur disagree, and they say they would read on the 14th. Yad Ephraim says you have to read it also on the 14th, but the Chazon Ish says no, that he doesn't consider the Ramban Shita. He says that's going according to Das Yochid, and therefore you would read it on the 15th. This is Nogei Lamaisa. It was in the old city of Yerushalayim. There, when there were no Jews there, you weren't 10 batlonim, and there was a chash that they would have to read it in Yerushalayim on the 14th. And there were those who were machmir to read it on the 15th. Remain be'ir. If there's no 10 people, the Maggid Mishnah cites the Yerushalmi. The Ravid disagrees with the Rambam. Kosav oisoi ve'eletam. He wrote something that has no meaning. Maybe because it's not like kfar, it's not a kfar, but a klum. In other words, when they said the kforim will go earlier to the Yom HaKnisa, it has to have a name kfar. If there's no 10 people that live there, it doesn't have a name of a kfar to go earlier to the Yom HaKnisa. They said, when is a city called an Ir Anidachas? As soon as they had from 10 till 100, the Rabbi Yoshia. Yonasan says, so Rashi explains that less than 10 is not called a city. And in order to be Ir Anidachas, you need to have a name of a city. Yeshaya, you need to have more than 100. It's not considered, till it doesn't have 100 is not considered a city, only a community. In a community, you don't say the din of Ir Anidachas. And the Peirush Yerushalmi, Ir, when it says in Yerushalmi Ir, that the Torah calls it an Ir Anidachas, like kfar, it doesn't use the word kfar, because Ir v'lo krach has to be a city and not a krach, because a krach is not judged in dine Ir Anidachas, is yosim a krachu. If it has more than 100, it's a krach. and you don't consider it any dachas. Asor, it's a kvaru. Pos ma'asor lo ir v'lo kvar. Less than 10 is neither a city nor a kvar. From this, the Rambam understood that Yerushalmi is the source of the Rambam. If there's no 10 people, it's not considered a kvar. And therefore, you read on the 14th, you don't make it earlier, because only kvarim were permitted to make it earlier. Only by kvar they said you can go earlier. This still doesn't prove anything. I'll tell you, I'll tell you that that's also a kvar, and it would go earlier. The Radvaz asks a question. Since the Ravid cites the source of the Rambam, the Yerushalmi, how does he say it has no source, has no meaning? Furthermore, what does he add when he says it's not enough? I could always tell you 10, less than 10 is a kvar. And he explains that the Ravid adds, Ve'en lo tam, since we learned in the Brisa, in Megillah, stam, and there's no machlokes Rameir Rabbi Yehuda. Therefore, the whole halacha has no reasoning, because that they are less than 10 doesn't make it considered a city, and therefore we can't paskin like the Brisa. Furthermore, the Ridvaz takes the lotion of the Yerushalmi that the Ravid said kvorim makdimim, right? So it has to be a kvar to be considered something that goes before, because that's the lotion of the Yerushalmi, ir v'lo kvar, ir v'lo krach, and it has to have from 5 till 10 people. The Rameir Yehuda says from 100 until the majority of a shevet. But this language too is very bewildering. How could Rameir say that with 6 people it's called a city, and 11 is called a krach? And furthermore, they seem to be disagreeing from one end of the spectrum to the other end of the spectrum. It must be the correct text should read, and we'll turn the page, that from 10 till 100 is considered is what Rameir is talking about. The Ravid, his text in the Yerushalmi was more than 100, it's a krach. Less than 10, it's not a city nor a krach. Why does he mention v'lo kvar? It's not a kvar. You should have said less than 10 is not a city. That would be enough. It comes to tell us, so he's definitely coming to tell us by Mikra Megillah that less than 10 is not considered a kvar. And that's according to the one who says that in the Brisa of Masechta Megillah. So we have the 2 Brises that are like Rameir. We do not go according to Rameir Halacha, like Rabbi Yehuda, that we cut from 100 till the majority of a shevet. And only according to Rameir, there's no difference between 10 to less than 10. Therefore, the Ravid writes, since it's only going according to Rameir, so the Rambam can't bring a raya from there. That even though we find Yerushalmi, Klal is Rameir Rabbi Yehuda, halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says that anything that's less than 100 would go to being a earlier date. The Maraponim, the Meister Keach question from Hilchos Megillah. Ir Dachas needs to be a city, not a kvar katan, not a krach godel. Less than 100 is a kvar. The majority of a shevet is a krach godel. Like Rabbi Yehuda in Yerushalmi, and Rabbi Yonis in the Bavli. And why? By Megillah, Rambam says like Rameir that less than 10 is not considered a kvar, and he doesn't mention what he mentions by Yonei Dachas. Maripona wants to explain that Yonei Dachas, the Posuk says Yoshvei Ho'irahu, they have to be inhabited. And the word Yoshvei is extra, because it says Kisishma Ba'achas Orecho, it says you shall hear about one of your cities. It must be telling us that Ir, specifically, Yoshvei is telling us that Ir v'lo kvar. Therefore, less is nothing. Al Megillah doesn't say how many people have to be in a kvar. It goes earlier, and therefore the Yerushalmi and Sanhedrin has nothing to do with Yerushalmi and Megillah. The Rambam cites the Yerushalmi and Megillah as the simple statement because only if you have 10 people there's a possibility of gathering together. Therefore, you make it earlier. He says, logically, if you don't have 10 people, you're not going to gather together. When you don't have 10 people, what do you mean the day of gathering? It has nothing to do because of kvar, whether it's called a kvar or not a kvar. And the Tzavnas Paneach also says that in order to go to earlier date, you have to have 10. And since there's no 10, it can't be called, you can't read it before your dalid. Any that sheloi bezman tzor davka asor. The Meiser Rekeach explains that the Rambam understood the mission to say when is this so, when you start off on the second and the fifth. But if they don't gather on the second and the fifth, you don't read only on the 14th. This means the days that you come to the Beis HaKnesses, and according to his shita, on the second and the fifth, they gather together in the Purim. Is not talking about others that come from outside. So therefore you have to have a day of Kriyas HaTorah. If you have a minyan, it's not called Yom HaKnisa, even though they can gather together. He adds furthermore, I was seen to conclude, since the Rambam is of the opinion that Megillah, Shloi B'Zmano, a Megillah not in its proper time, you don't read it with less than 10 people, as we learned earlier. And here, there's no 10 people, so it's impossible to read it on Yom HaKnisa. That's Shloi B'Zmano, like the Tzavnas Paneach. The Meiser Rekeach adds a proof that you can't say that the Rambam is like the meant to say what the Ravid explained, because only a kvar can do it earlier, because the Rambam doesn't say whether it has a din of a ear or not kvar. He says it's ka'anshi ear, kimnei ear. They read on the 14th, meaning that they're obligated to read only on the 14th because, for two reasons, because they don't have gathering on the second, on Monday and Thursday in their shuls, and also because it would be not in the proper time. When you don't have the proper time, you need 10 automatically, because otherwise you can't read it. The Maggid Mishnah says one should not be too extensive here, because we don't have any reading before the 14th in our times, as we'll see soon in Halacha Tes, that the din of Kedima L'Yom HaKnisa was nullified entirely. So it's a theoretical debate at the moment, and therefore it doesn't make a difference, and either you read on the 14th or the 15th if you're a walled city.